All right, well, thank you everyone for attending our November meeting for Coast Geological Society. This month we have Larry Gurrola who's going to be doing our talk. So I'm going to introduce Larry, give you a little bit of a bio. So Dr. Larry Gurrola obtained his BS and MS in geology from San Diego State University, where he studied paleo earthquakes of the splay of the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. He continued at UC Santa Barbara with a PhD research on the active tectonics and the quaternary geology of the Santa Barbara coastal plain. His publications include establishing the quaternary chronology and uplift rates of the Santa Barbara coastal plain, fault activity, and landslide hazards. A registered professional geologist and certified engineering geologist, he consults in Southern and Northern California and leads the debris flow mitigation study funded by the Partnership of Resilient Communities. Dr. Gurrola served as past treasurer and vice president of the Coast Geological Society in Ventura and has presented numerous talks on earthquake and landslide hazards to local schools, government agencies, first responders, and other regional geologic studies. He is a member of the Association of Environmental and Engineering Geologists, Geological Society of America, American Society of Civil Engineers, the Pacific Section Society of Sedimentary Geology, and Coast Geological Society Ventura Chapter. He has participated as a volunteer member of the 2018 Technical Advisory Board for the American Institute of Architects for the Montecito Debris Flow Recovery Committee. So with that, we're going to start our meeting. Please remember that we do have the chat function available. So if you guys have any questions regarding the presentation at the end, we will go ahead and answer those questions through the chat. And without further ado, here's Larry Gurrola.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here. Great to be in front of my friends and colleagues. And on behalf of myself and Dr. J. David Rogers, we are pleased to present the fire, flood, and landslide dam history of Montecito and southern Santa Barbara County. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the folks listed here for their assistance throughout the study on various aspects. The January 9 Montecito debris flows occurred following the Thomas Fire of 2017-2018. The Thomas Fire burned through the eastern Santa Barbara County watersheds of Carpinteria and Montecito in late December 2017, early January 2018. A storm triggered debris flows out of all the Montecito watersheds early Tuesday morning on the 9th, and also triggered debris flows from some of the Carpinteria watersheds. In Montecito, 23 fatalities resulted. Over 400 homes were destroyed or damaged, and there were many hundreds of millions of dollars in economic losses, as well as Highway 101 was closed for 12 days. So there were many direct and indirect impacts in terms of cost. Here's a Google Earth image showing the inundation of Montecito in the center left area. Summerland is in the central area shown here, and Carpinteria is in the center lower right area. This gives you a kind of an appreciation for the extent of the debris flows of the 1/9 event. As a result of the 1/9 event, a community study was initiated with the principal goal of identifying locations to develop debris retention structures along the principal creeks. Our philosophy is the redundancy of the system so that if any one structure or system fails, there's a backup system. We require that our debris retention systems are robust to withstand the high force impacts of trees, logs, and massive boulders. And we aim to strive for resilient structures for the long-term protection. The project team is myself, Dr. J. David Rogers, Dr. Ben Willardson, Dr. Kenneth Boyko, and Hassan Kazray. Debris retention systems, i.e. debris basins, captured coarse boulder and vegetation debris, thereby reducing the bulking of the debris flows and reducing the potential for downstream blockage in constriction points, bridges, culverts, and such. Our aim is to significantly reduce impacts of a 1.9 magnitude event. And yes, that is a lofty goal. We plan to develop a master plan to lay the foundation to guide future work mitigating these hazards in Montecito, and our approach to multifaceted hazards analysis. Here's a couple images of Old Spanish Town, which was located on the banks of Montecito Creek, that was reported to have been wiped off the map as a result of the 1914 debris flows. This is very similar to what occurred in the 1.9 event, massive destruction along the Montecito Creek banks, and specifically in this location. So there are certainly lessons to be learned from the past. Our current work is aiming to understand the past history. What are the number of events recorded in historical accounts? Our history goes back about 200 years. How many of these debris flows occurred in Montecito? And what about the surrounding watersheds in Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, Goleta? So we're accounting for those as well. We aim to identify the number of debris flows that occurred within a 5-year period of post-fire conditions, so we can identify post-fire debris flows. What were the impacts of these events? The relative magnitude, the inundation extent, where were the sites of avulsion, and where did the out of channel flow paths go? Given the multiple watersheds of Montecito, what is the reoccurrence of these events? And for any one watershed in Montecito that experienced a recent debris flow event, what's the potential for another recurrence in that same watershed? Our study has subdivided the Montecito watersheds into 3 areas. Our first phase focuses in on Montecito Creek watershed with the Cold Springs and Hot Springs tributaries, followed by Oak Creek, San Ysidro Creek watersheds, and lastly, Buena Vista and Paquet Romero Creek watersheds. Our methodology includes collecting fire, flood, and landslide data for the last 200 years, review historic maps, aerial photographs that go back to about 1928, LiDAR images from more recent LiDAR that's typically 2006 and later. This is combined with field mapping and analysis, as well as review of local, state, federal reports and local historic accounts. Our products include creating an inventory of the past debris flows and debris-laden flood events, identifying which of those occurred within a 5-year period of post-fire conditions. And from this, we can create inventory of damages. 1914 event was the test, so to speak, because it actually provided sufficient data, numerous accounts, some in great detail, and there was quite a bit of cross-referencing of being able to document the facts from multiple cross-reference accounts. From this inventory of damages, we're able to recreate the flow paths from the 1914 event, where areas were inundated, and we can identify avulsion sites. From this, we can identify high hazard zones. One interesting aspect of the study was the recognition of landslide dams in our watersheds and the occurrence of outbreak floods. We also will produce a landslide map of Montecito Creek, identifying which of these landslides has the potential to form dams. The community of Montecito is located on the south flank of the Santa Ynez Mountain range. This east-west trending mountain range is a result of high uplift rates and erodible sedimentary rocks that create steep confined drainages with highly erodible slopes. The focus of our current study is Montecito Creek with the Cold Springs and Hot Springs tributaries. If we zoom in on the upper part of the tributaries, the Cold Springs and Hot Springs tributaries, Cold Springs is subdivided into a West Fork and East Fork, and Hot Springs is just a smaller watershed to the east. The image on the right shows the Montecito Creek watershed, and Montecito Creek, which is located below the confluence of Cold Springs Creek and Hot Springs Creek. I think the residents are well educated now to understand that they live on debris fans. Debris fans are alluvial fans composed of debris flow deposits that have occurred over the eons. Subsurface data from water wells, geotechnical data, but mainly from deep water wells, indicates that there are over 600 feet of accumulated debris flow deposits in lower Montecito. These are a result of repeated multiple debris flows, debris floods, and floods. You can see the tongue-shaped alluvial fans featured, shown in orange. I created a second generation map of the debris flow landforms. This allowed us to actually identify and map debris flow landforms such as individual flows, lobes, debris flow snouts, plugs, boulder levees, and fields. And in these kind of detailed areas of the yellow, the magenta, those are the features that we can observe that are highly preserved, especially near the canyon mouths. The fire history for Santa Barbara County is quite extensive. It goes back 150, 200 years actually. But if we look at the Mensing and others study, they identified 20 large wildfires in sediments in the last 560 years. This is an average return time of fires from about 20 to 30 years. So this is important data here. I thought this was an interesting view of Hot Springs Canyon in the 1800s. A fire devastated Montecito and burned into Hot Springs Canyon in 1871. It burned down all the small outbuildings associated with the Hot Springs Resort. And these are the buildings of the Hot Springs Resort. The upper images, 1876 and 1877, show that the watershed hasn't completely recovered after 5-6 years. If you look at the lower images, you can see that the sorry about that. You can see that the watershed, the vegetation of the watershed is much more robust and thicker as compared to the earlier images. All right, let me just turn off my email so it doesn't pop up. Okay. Just so we're all on the same page, post-fire debris flows generally occur within 2 to 3 years following wildfires and can extend up to about 5 years. The wildfires create water repellent soils, decrease infiltration, increase runoff and erosion. The loss of the vegetation canopy leads to increased runoff. The loss and burn of the leaf litter and the duff makes surface water run off even faster, can't be detained by these leaves and branches and duff on the ground surface. It's one of my interesting surprises in the study was that the first mention of the association of wildfire with increased flood hazards was in 1879, which was some 65 years before the 1934 La Crescenta debris flows. I was actually quite surprised on reading that. Debris flows are triggered by high intensity, short duration rainfall and also by long duration rainfall on saturated ground. I'm going to be using terms floods, debris flows, landslide dam, and outbreak floods. So I thought we'd just go over this very briefly. A flood is a normal or quasi clearwater flood. It transports fine sediment in small quantities, and the suspended sediment really has no effect on the flow behavior. Debris-laden floods destabilizes stream beds, channel banks, erodes them, just incorporates that stream bed material into bed load, and transports large volumes of coarse debris onto the fan as bed load. Debris-laden floods also fill in creek channels with debris, creating out-of-channel deposition and impacts with infrastructure and homes. The images on the right, the upper right, you can see that Buena Vista Creek is entirely filled in by the 1995 debris floods, and you can see that the deposition extends outside of the channel banks. Below, the creek is restored, likely by the Army Corps when they come in and clear out the creeks. Debris flows are rapidly moving flows that freight massive boulders, logs, trees, and within a slurry of suspended fine sediment, mud. As they travel down these deep confined channels, they incorporate creek bed alluvium, anything that incorporates and builds up the boulder snout. Oftentimes, the front face of these snouts are armored with boulders, trees, logs, and this was actually noted in a number of counts in the history. Just a side note, how do these massive boulders get freighted by the debris flows? And in clear water, a submerged boulder only weighs about 64% of its dry unit weight due to buoyancy of the water. In a debris flow with 65% entrained solids, the same boulder would only weigh 22% of its dry weight, thereby being able to carry them off great distances. Landslide dam and outbreak floods are the most destructive flood events, generating debris floods and debris flows. They increase the peak discharge far in excess of normal overland flow by allowing a temporary lake to build up behind the dam. These lakes typically overtop and breach within a 12 to 24-hour period. The image on the right is a 1929 aerial photo of Santa Monica Creek, actually called Fithian Canyon back then. And Supervisor Dedrick, who actually lived below the canyon mouth, was nearly killed by a 20-foot high wall of water and debris in 1914 flowing out of Santa Monica Canyon. I think that this is the best candidate for that landslide dam. As you can see, the creek is shunted over by the landslide. In creating an inventory of events, we've identified a minimum of 22 debris flows and debris-laden floods in the last 200 years in southern Santa Barbara County. 13 of these 22 debris flow events occurred in the Montecito watersheds, and 10 of these that occurred in the Montecito watersheds were post-fire debris flows. There was a total of 36 flood events for all of southern Santa Barbara County, and that includes clear water floods, debris flows, and debris floods. The 1861 mega flood was likely the largest recorded event inundating the Southwest US and the entire coastal California. Other large events referenced to be similar in magnitude include the 1825 and the 1924 events. The 1914 event was cited in several accounts as the worst flood in history, producing greater damage than 1861. That may be a function of greater development in the area, but that's what history reports. In terms of the inventory of flood events, this slide shows the 19th century events, beginning with the 1825 debris flow event. That was a regional event. We're inquiring on learning more about this event, but it was a post-fire event, and it was noted that a fire actually burned down all the trees in the watersheds in the area, and that it actually burned into town, and the residents of the town of the area actually had to go stay on the beach for a few days due to the fire intensity and the heat and the smoke. The 1861 mega flood certainly produced debris flows and debris-laden floods regionally. This 1861 was actually the first recorded landslide dam outbreak flood, and I'll touch upon that in a moment or two. Colonel Dinsmore, who the canyon was named for, and this was San Ysidro Creek in 1872, reported a tidal wave of 15 feet of logs, trees, and boulders coming down the canyon in the channel and up out of the channel that wiped out and created great damage. And within a half an hour, the creek was reported back to just flowing normally. There's another smaller debris flow event in Hot Springs in 1879. And in 1879, there's a landslide dam outbreak flood that was reported in great detail, and I'll talk about that here shortly. Let's see here. Moving on to the early 20th century events, most notably the 1914 event was a very large event. It actually produced 3 debris flow events, one on January 25th, another, the second on February 18th, and the third on February 20th. These were reported from Gaviota to Carpinteria and into Ojai via Casitas Pass. I'll talk about more about that here shortly. 1926, additional debris flows in Montecito with another landslide dam outbreak flood reported in San Isidro Creek. And the more recent events, the 1964 Coyote Fire, which occurred in September 1964, resulted in 3 events. The 1964 November debris flows in Montecito and Santa Barbara. The 1967 debris-laden floods in Santa Barbara. And it's interesting that James Stubchair, who was the flood control manager back then, actually reported that this event in 1967 was far more damaging than the 1969 floods in Santa Barbara. The third event was the 1969 debris flows in Montecito and Carpinteria. There was great devastation in both these communities, and over 1,000 residents in Carpinteria were homeless as a result of this event. James Stubchair, again, of the county flood control manager, reported debris dams throughout the creeks and landslide dams that failed as well. We'll talk about that. 1971, Romero Creek debris flows affected the eastern watersheds of Montecito and the western watersheds of Carpinteria. The 1995 debris-laden floods that affected Montecito, Carpinteria, Goleta Creeks was actually produced more debris than the 1/9 event. And that was reported by Tom Fairham, who's the current county flood control manager. And this was countywide. And he said that that event produced far more debris than the 1/9 event. Here's the 2018 1/9 event as well, very significant. And then in between were sprinkled a couple smaller events as well. The January 25th, 1914 debris flow event was a post-fire debris flow in Montecito and Carpinteria only. There were actually quite detailed descriptions of the storm event, which approached from the south side of the Santa Ynez Range and produced significantly more rain on the south side of the range. And this is a result of the orographic effects of the approach of the storm and the Santa Ynez Mountain Range. More than 15 inches of precipitation was reported between January 15th and 25th. Just under 9 inches fell beginning on January 23rd, with 4.5 inches of rain in a 2-hour period on the 25th. It produced debris flows out of every watershed from Gaviota to Carpinteria, extended off into Ventura, into Casitas Pass, and into Ojai. Every county bridge on the south coast was reported as destroyed, with Carpinteria and Montecito reported as the worst impacted communities. There were 2 fatalities in Montecito, 1 fatality in Santa Barbara, and 1 fatality in Carpinteria. It completely destroyed the Gould stone limit house in Lower Montecito. Here's a few more images of Montecito on the far left. Montecito Creek commonly just overbanks at the bridge at Hot Springs Creek and flows down Olive Mill. And once again, it did that in 1914. It created a new channel up to 20 feet deep. Again, in the central picture, Outer Bank flows down Olive Mill Road. This is in the vicinity of Casa Dorinda. And the far right picture is an image of a debris plug or possibly a frozen debris flow snout in Hot Springs Creek. And you can see that the locals are quite fascinated by it. The 1914 debris flow event also affected Santa Barbara, producing much debris in the streets in Santa Barbara and debris plugging bridges. You can see workers here working to clear the bridge with much debris blocked by the bridge. And this is a common theme in these events. A 20-foot high waterfall was formed in San Ysidro Creek. And once again, this is probably a frozen debris flow snout or possibly a debris plug. As I previously mentioned, the historical accounts provide sufficient data to basically tally the inventory of damaged properties. Once I can identify the damaged properties, I refer back to an early 19th century, actually multiple 19th century property maps, and I can map out the damages and the degree of damages. From this, I can reconstruct flow paths and identify avulsion sites. Several accounts note out-of-bank flow paths from Cold Springs, Hot Springs, Montecito, flowing down street paths, much like 19. Interesting aspect from the 1914 event is that Lower Montecito Creek actually flowed out of bank and flowed about roughly just shy of about a half a mile to the east and entered the ocean where Oak Creek is now. This was actually referred to as Montecito Creek reoccupying its old channel. So that's interesting fact. I mentioned that historic old town, Spanish town, was devastated, 15 buildings destroyed, one large adobe destroyed. All Carpinteria creeks were reported plugged with debris at the canyon mouths, creating new channel flow paths. This actually resulted in quite a bit of lawsuits after the fact, because property lines were often defined by the creek channel. And if the creek channels move as a result of this, one property owner gains property at the loss of the neighboring property. And some property owners liked the new channel paths, others wanted to restore them. So there was lawsuits as to the effect of that, and making the other property owner restore the channel paths. According to Reverend W.F.S. Nelson, most of the damage in Santa Barbara was along Mission Creek, 5 bridges wiped out, 25 houses destroyed. Huge boulders and trees with trunks up to 3 feet diameter were carried by different creeks. 2 to 3 feet of mud deposited on the lower fan in the city. And an account describes numerous landslides that threatened to dam up Mission Canyon and Mission Creek. And this was also reported in the 3rd debris flow event on February 20, 1914. As I mentioned, I was able to recreate the flow paths by creating an inventory of damages, properties, and what I did is the red arrows show the debris flows paths. I couldn't quite create the limits where I can say the flow was on this side of it and not on that side of it, but this allows us to get a good idea of where the flow paths went and where they came out of. Here's Hot Springs Creek, and the flow paths went through Riven Rock and just flowed right down towards Old Spanish Town, and it wiped out this bridge. Cold Springs Creek diverged in this area, marooned some folks up here, and then also merged with Hot Springs, creating much damage at Old Spanish Town. Now, these smaller drainages actually created debris flows, and the old Dean School, which is now Westmont College, actually was damaged. No fatalities, but there were some small buildings destroyed, barn destroyed, 7 or 9 horses killed, and debris flows went into this vicinity, into Sycamore Creek. Sycamore Canyon was actually reported just full of tree debris and plugged. If we now focus in on the lower portion, I'll move in a little bit closer here. Here's the debris flows in the upper paths here. And here's the flow paths in the lower path. This double solid line is the Old Coast Highway alignment. And you can see in the white lines is the Highway 101. So for 1914, the Old Coast Highway diverted some of these flows to the east, and you can see quite the distance that the flows went. And this is where Oak creek flows out into the ocean. And this is what was referenced as the old creek path of Montecito Creek. I also took all the historic maps from 1869 to present, and I plotted all the creek courses. 1947, 1907, 1914, and so on. Here's what the flow paths look like in the lower Montecito Creek. And here is likely where Montecito Creek used to flow out, either coming out likely in this direction here. And this is where Oak Creek is now. And you can see the multiple channel paths of Montecito Creek. The second debris flow event occurred on February 18th when 3 inches of rain fell. George W. Russell measured 2/3 of an inch of rain in 20 minutes on February 18th. And that's similar rainfall intensity to the recent 1/9 event. One fatality occurred when a doctor couldn't reach his patient and she passed away. The flows crossed the coast highway in Montecito and Carpinteria. Once again, Montecito Creek plugged at Hot Springs, flowed down Olive Mill Road. Part of the flows actually were diverted again down to the former Oak Creek path, and there were similar flow paths as the January 25 event. Old Spanish Town was again flooded under several feet of water. Carpinteria absorbed the worst of the storm. Carpinteria Creek was described as continually changing its course. The creek flows from the various canyons jumped their channel banks again and basically reoccupied the new channel courses formed on January 25th. The temporary bridges that were put in place for people to get around were again destroyed, railroad bridges destroyed, and Supervisor Dedrick had reported that about 1/4, about a foot of silt and mud were actually removed by these flows. So there was about 3 to 4 feet of silt and mud placed on the coast highway by the first event, and this event washed away or winnowed away about a foot of that. The third debris flow event occurred after about 6 inches of rain, and heavy damages were reported in Santa Barbara. Trees and other debris were clogging up bridges. The street department was actively trying to break up these blockages, but it was impossible, and it overflowed its bank due to the blockages. There were reports of large landslide carrying great masses of brush, rocks, and trees, threatening to dam up the floods. And this report reaffirms that there were landslide outbreak floods occurring in the first event, sending walls of water upon the city of Santa Barbara. The 1964 Coyote Fire shown here, it occurred in September 1964, and it's roughly about 65,000 acres, and it resulted in post-fire conditions in the Montecito and Santa Barbara watersheds. Montecito is located here, and you can see Santa Barbara's out here. On the 9th and 10th of November 1964, heavy showers occurred early in the morning, and a Montecito resident reported that about 2/3 of an inch of rain fell in 20 minutes. Once again, that's 2/3 of an inch in 20 minutes. A total of an inch of rain was measured on the 9th, and about 1/3 of an inch was measured on the 10th. Debris flows occurred on November 9th, with additional flows and damages reported on the 10th. So this shows how sensitive the watersheds are. Debris flows were reported from Cold Springs, Hot Springs, Montecito, and to the west, Atascadero, Maria Ignacio, and San Antonio Creeks. Damage was reported at the bridge crossings on Highway 101. A resident whose house was inundated and damaged on San Ysidro Creek described the debris flow as it approached her home as an avalanche of dry rocks with a huge mass of water and mud behind it. Here's some images of the 1964 debris flows. On the left is logs and boulders plugging the bridge on Cold Springs Creek. To the right is the clearing of logs and boulders on the bridge of San Ysidro Creek. Now, it's really interesting that this occurred in the same year, 1964, November 1964, a couple months after the fire. They were very concerned that additional debris flows were going to occur, and they realized that the bridges, the culverts, were plugging them and causing overbank flows. So they removed and basically demoed a number of bridges and culverts, both public and private, so that future debris flows could get past these constriction points. This location right here, the bridge was destroyed to allow for future debris flows to pass. And it took, I think, a year and a half or so for this bridge to be rebuilt. So this was a great concern for first responders because they could no longer use this to get from point A to point B across the creek here. Additional pictures of debris flow show much debris and mud filling San Ysidro Creek. To the right, to the left is Hot Springs Creek. You can't even recognize the channel. And similarly, like 1-9, a gas main was bent in San Ysidro Creek. Additional pictures show abundant debris, huge massive boulders, mud, silt. And the upper right photo shows them once again having to drill and blast boulders in San Ysidro Creek to get them to clear the creek. The 1969 debris flow event, this was the third debris flow event following the 1964 Coyote Fire. James Dubchair described Montecito as hard hit by the January floods. However, it's interesting that he, as I mentioned, he reports that the 1967 debris-laden floods were more severe in Santa Barbara than this event was in Santa Barbara. He also mentions that the 1914 flood debris flows were more severe in all South Coast streams than this event. That says something right there. Substantial rain of over 10 inches occurred in 4 days between the 19th and the 22nd. Heavy rainfall was recorded on the 25th when all this damage occurred, and it exceeded the 100-year flow on the Santa Ynez River. And you look at these rainfall amounts, they're just incredible. 6 inches at Cold Springs Debris Basin, over 7 inches at Dalton Tunnel, nearly 6 inches at Casa Dorinda. The high intensity rainfall about 5 a.m. caused dams to fall in domino fashion, resulting in walls of trees, boulders, and water moving down the channels at high velocity. Bridges and other constriction points created log jams and overflows. And it's actually interesting that a newspaper account states that Montecito will not have adequate flood protection until a series of large capacity debris basins can be constructed in the mouths of the Montecito canyons. The creeks had to be restored to their original channels and configurations. Much debris, like you would expect in a debris flow, Romero Creek, San Ysidro Creek, the two right are in the Glen Oaks area, and there was much damage and debris produced as the result of these debris flows. This is an interesting image. Sorry, the image is so poor, but it's a scan of a newspaper image of a Xerox copy. And this was actually, there was actually a building that connected the two. That's Oak Creek in between them. And they actually built a structure over it so they could walk from building to building, but that was destroyed. Here's an inundation map of the 1969 debris flows. And I assimilated this into my flow path map. And assimilating these events, once again, the red arrows are the 1914 debris flow paths. The black dashed line here and down below is the 1964 debris flow inundation extent. The blue extent is the 1969 debris flows, and the magenta is the 1-9 event. And you can see how for Montecito Creek and Hot Springs, it largely mimics itself. Here's a blow up of the lower area. And for the most part, the flows mimic, except for the 1914 debris flows that were diverted to the east. And this is largely the result of the alignment of the old coast highway. Once it was replaced with Highway 101, it doesn't appear that there were any flows in this direction. Once again, the creeks, creek courses. Landslide dams and outbreak floods. This was a very interesting and surprising discovery. The first outbreak flood account was reported in Fithian Canyon, Santa Monica Canyon, 1861. Early Carpinteria settler, former sheriff to Santa Barbara, district attorney, state legislator Russell Heath and his family recounted that the flood occurred on a clear moonlight night, some after the rains had ceased earlier in the day. The outbreak flood inundated the Heath home, which they had to secure to save from losing it. And once the flood kind of diminished, it left about 1.5 feet of water on the coastal plain. They were located about the mid-fan area of Carpinteria, located north of 101, if you know where that is, relative to Carpinteria. The next recorded landslide dam outbreak was recorded in great detail in December 1879. As I mentioned, this is the earliest account to relate post-fire conditions to stripping of trees, logs, and boulders to be discharged from the mountains. Some think the sudden great rise in these streams was caused by heavy rains in the burnt regions of the mountains, which rushed abruptly into the canyons, carrying down a large amount of driftwood, which clogged in the narrow gorges, forming a succession of dams, all of which were liberated by the giving way of one of the upper ones. One place was found where a dam had given way after filling to a height of 40 feet. John Pettinger, who lived in that Santa Monica Pettinger Canyon, described having heard boulders move in the creek many times before, but described this noise so great at 5 a.m. he rushed to the door to see a flood wave of trees, logs, and boulders break through his fence 25 yards away. He barely had time to push away his wife and try and get out of the way. The debris flow impacted, destroyed his home, washed out the residents of the property. Unfortunately, Mrs. Pettinger and a ranch worker were killed in this event. I should mention that examination of the creek of the Pettinger Canyon after the fact identified a dam height of 40 feet and evidence that the water level was raised 40 feet above normal creek flow. 1906 landslide dam in Conchita Creek. This was actually an interesting one in that a large landslide of about 10 to 12 acres was discovered slowly moving due to the undercutting of the creek. This is in the general vicinity of the north slope of Rincon Mountain, basically the backside of La Conchita. It buried the road, the bridge, and covered over the creek channel with about 40 feet of debris. It moved as a coherent mass, and it was noted that the trees and shrubs remained standing, like they were still alive. The creek was diverted around the large slide mass, and carriages could actually travel over the mass to get to the other side. The creek was likely diverted and didn't create a landslide dam, likely due to the slow movement of the landslide, which allowed the slow diversion of the creek and have it shunted to the other side of the valley and allowing it to remove material and continue its flow path. In 1909, there was a great landslide reported by the morning press, and this followed about 20 inches of rain during a 1-month period. Colonel Slauson, who had an office in downtown Santa Barbara, Colonel Slauson was with the National Forest Service, described a great hunk of the mountain which was gone, and it was visible from downtown Santa Barbara. It was also noted that you could see the headscarp of the slide from any third-story building in Santa Barbara, nearly 5 miles away. Just a side fact that this occurred prior to the 1925 earthquake, so there's really not too many third-story buildings remaining these days. The image on the left is a 1929 aerial image that's unmarked. The aerial on the right is the same image denotes the 1909 landslide, the headscarp on the west fork of Cold Springs. Another large landslide is located just south of it. And another large landslide is present in Hot Springs Creek. Here's my geomorphologic mapping of the watershed and the alluvial fans. The square box shows a blow up of the image to the right. And this square box right here is going to be shown in this image right here. This is the 1909 landslide and a blow up. You can see the steep scarp, amphitheater-shaped headscarp. Here's the southern landslide, and you can see that the creek is shunted around the landslide toe. The upper portion of the landslide or the headscarp area is underlain by Mytilhouse sandstone. The lower portion is Cozy Dell. The contact kind of swings around through here and trends off to the west. Here's Google Earth images of the same features, and you'll see another landslide dam here that was actually mapped in the 19 event. Comparison of topographic maps from 1901 and 1944 allow for profiles to be constructed. To the right is the profile construction. The dashed line is the 1901 surface profile. The solid line is the ground surface from 1944. You can see that the creek has been shunted to the west about 200 feet. We believe that this created a landslide dam in 1914. And this helps us to understand the process where you have a landslide dam, you have a landslide creating a landslide dam, dam breaches, the creek continues on past the toe, the toe gets continually eroded by the creek, possibly another debris flow event or debris flood event occurs, lowering the creek bed and daylighting the slide plane, thus destabilizing the slide plane. And thus we kind of recreate the process with reactivation, reforming a landslide dam, and then the process repeats. These are the toe scarps that I just showed you. On the left is the 1909 landslide. It's a little tough getting a good view of it because you're kind of constrained in the drainage. And the toe scarps, the two images on the right, are the adjacent landslide to the south. It's interesting, the 1914 landslide and landslide dams were actually observed by Forest Ranger H.W. Mazel, and he describes his observations from the ridge line as long continued rains let loose slides, forming dams, stopping up channels until the weight of the water was too great for the walls of debris to hold. And one after another, they would break, sending torrents to swell the floods. County surveyor Frank Flornay examined the watersheds, and he said that he examined all the watersheds in 1914 after the fact. The landslides and debris in the creeks that did the damage by impounding water, which would break the walls of debris of their own weight and pour floods upon the city and valley. He also stated, until they became a rolling mass of water, trees, and rocks, making dams here and there, only to break loose by others piling in, causing a toboggan slide, so as to say, of the whole canyon. More recent landslide dams occurred in La Conchita. We're all aware of the 1995 La Conchita landslide that buried 9 homes. Well, a landslide dam actually created the debris flow out of the canyon to the west of La Conchita. This was actually brought to my attention by Jim Otusa of the County of Ventura, and we appreciate that very much. Downstream landslides, as you can see, landslides added sediment and debris that was incorporated in terms of the breakout. The debris flow occurred on evening March 10th, maybe early March 11th. You can see the debris flow flowing out onto the old banana plantation. If you recall, back in the 90s, there was a banana plantation out just to the west of La Conchita, and it inundated 5 homes. And it also blocked northbound Highway 101 for a day or two. The arrow indicates where the blockage had occurred. blockage and the breach are probably best described as a pond breach. There wasn't really a big lake formed, but more of a pond. And this pond actually slurried out and created a debris flow. And you can see the numerous landslides on the side slopes. Okay, lastly, the 1998 Ventura Landslide Dam. This was a really interesting find, and I think it's a really good example to try and ascertain how they successfully drained it. It was first discovered by Sheriff's Air Unit the week of February 10th in the East Fork of Hall Canyon, shown right here. Here's downtown Ventura. They assumed that the lake had been filling for about 2 to 3 days. They estimated the landslide about 5 acres, and it had pinched off the canyon, creating a temporary lake. The geology in this area is the slopes are composed of Pico Formation, which are fine-grained siltstones, mudstones, and claystones. A 3-acre lake was reported on February 16th. They identified the hazard of moderate to on the high end for 60 plus homes and Ventura High School, which is just downstream. City agencies and Texaco employees, Texaco and other oil companies leased the land, so they had equipment up there, they had infrastructure. So they worked together to develop a plan, implement the plan, and then had to reformulate the plan as the dynamics of the situation changed. Texaco installed 4 13,000 gallon per minute pumps. This lowered the water level about a foot, and this was maybe after a day or two of pumping. So this gives an idea of the size of the lake that was formed. They measured the lake depth of about 30 feet, but they also noted that the lower portion was heavily silted with basically a muddy ooze. The lake level was in 2 feet of cresting the landslide dam, and this was of great concern. The impending rains required reformulating the plan, and they took into consideration that the dam consisted of cohesive materials. There was a fast-moving storm that eventually dumped 2 inches of rain, and that resulted in a rise of 6 to 7 feet of the water level in the lake. In re-evaluating and re-implementing their plan, they built the dam up several feet beyond that 6 to 7 feet rise. They also reinforced the buttress of the dam, which increased the stability of the dam, and then they also decreased the spillway gradient. They carved a broad swale into the landslide dam crest, not a V-ditch, but just lowered it slowly to allow it to spill gently. And they kept a close eye watch on it as it spilled. They had people up and down the canyon watching out for anything that may occur. And the lake expanded to a 7-acre lake prior to draining. The flood potential was raised to 200 plus homes, including Ventura High School, and millions of gallons impounded. However, their plan for draining worked successfully after several days. And I think this is a really prime example of how oil industry in this case, works well in coordination and joining efforts with city agencies to mitigate a dangerous situation. From my interviews with city engineers and people that were there, it was really a team effort on their part. And I think that there's lessons to be learned here. So in summary, we had 22 debris flow events in the last 200 years, 13 debris flow events in Montecito, 10 of which were post-debris flows. The extent of the debris flows ranged from single watershed to multiple watersheds. Numerous landslide dams and outbreak flood events amplify the flood hazards during the El Nino winters. 3 debris flows events occurred as a result of the 1914 fires and the 1964 Coyote Fire. So we had 3 events each. I should point out that the 1914, the 3 events all occurred within a month. And in the 1964 post-Coyote Fire conditions, they occurred within a 5-year period. With a high degree of certainty, we believe that the 1861 and the 1914 events were greater in magnitude and inundation than the 19 event. 1825 is another candidate that we are researching at this time. 20th century debris flow paths in the Montecito Creek mimic the 19 flow paths. From this, we can recognize high hazard areas with the flow path map. We can recognize repeated avulsion sites, identifying critical areas on the creek courses. Moving forward, we'll continue with further research, mapping, and analysis. We can integrate this historical record into our modeling hazard assessment and integrate landslide dam outbreak floods analysis for potential inundation. Thank you very much. Oh,